400,000 plantain trees. That is the scale Burkina Faso says it wants to reach from a crop the country was only recently trying to prove it could grow commercially. And that is what makes this story unusual. Plantain needs reliable water. Burkina Faso sits inside the Sahel, where rainfall can decide whether a harvest survives. Yet farmers have already produced plantain, and local nurseries are now multiplying planting material inside the country. So why choose this crop? Is this simply an ambitious farming experiment, or is Burkina Faso using plantain to test something much bigger, a system built around water, local seed production, farmer skills, and replacing imports with domestic production? Because the real story may not be the bananas at all. Before we ask what is hidden behind Burkina Faso's plantain plan, we need to establish what has actually happened. Because this story did not begin with 400,000 trees, it began with a much smaller test. On June 28, 2025, officials from Burkina Faso's Presidential Initiative for Agricultural Production and Food Self-Sufficiency visited fields at Guiriko near Bobo Dioulasso. There, producers harvested plantain grown inside Burkina Faso. According to the presidency, more than 70,000 plantain suckers had been made available to producers under the initiative. Farmers also received training to agricultural inputs and hydro-agricultural equipment. In Kédougou province alone, 7,500 suckers were planted across roughly 3.5 hectares. That matters because the first question was not whether Burkina Faso could become a major plantain producer. The first question was much simpler. Could the crop work at all under local conditions? At Guiriko, one producer said yields on her site could reach between 30 and 35 tons per hectare. Program officials described the first trial as successful and at the time said they wanted to expand cultivation to around 70 hectares during the rainy season. That was the first proof point. Not a national transformation, not yet, but a crop that had moved from experiment to harvest, and then the story kept moving. By August 2025, the technical coordinator of the initiative said the program had around 81,000 plantain suckers, with about 70,000 remaining in the Guiriko region. More importantly, he said this planting material was expected to generate around 400,000 plants in 2026. That distinction matters. 400,000 was not a verified count of trees already planted across Burkina Faso. It was a multiplication target built from an existing stock of planting material. And by February 2026, Burkina 24 reported a fifth plantain harvest in the Guiriko region, this time at Nafaso, near Bobo Dioulasso. The site was not described as ideal farmland. According to the report, the soil was sandy and poor in nutrients. Producers relied on organic manure and adapted cultivation techniques to keep the plants developing. The report also said the earliest planting material had come from Ghana, but local nurseries were now producing suckers inside Burkina Faso. 150,000 plants had reportedly been distributed free to producers since the previous year. So by this point, three things had become clear. First, plantain production in Burkina Faso was no longer just a speech or a photograph of seedlings. There had been repeated harvests. Second, the program was trying to move from imported planting material toward domestic multiplication. And third, the number 400,000 only becomes meaningful if that multiplication continues beyond a few demonstration plots. This is where the story changes, because growing plantain on several successful sites is one challenge. Scaling it across hundreds of thousands of plants is another. At that scale, the questions become much harder. Where will the water come from? How much planting material can local nurseries actually produce? Can farmers maintain yields outside the first supervised sites? And even if the fruit reaches the market, can locally produced plantain compete with imports already arriving from neighboring countries? Those are the questions that determine whether this remains an agricultural demonstration or becomes a domestic industry. And that is what we are going to test. If you want analysis that follows the numbers beyond the announcement into the water, the economics, the imports, and the actual results, subscribe to the channel. Because now we need to understand why Burkina Faso may have chosen plantain in the first place. And the answer begins at the border. In 2024, Burkina Faso imported roughly 11.6 million kilograms of bananas and plantains, according to World Bank WITS trade data based on UN Comtrade. Almost all of that volume came from just two neighboring countries. Ghana supplied about 10.9 million kilograms. Côte d'Ivoire supplied another 670,000. There is an important limitation in that number. The trade category combines bananas and plantains, so it does not tell us exactly how many kilograms were plantain alone. But the larger economic pattern is clear. Burkina Faso has been buying millions of kilograms of this category of food from outside its borders. And that changes how we should look at the 400,000 plants. Because if Burkina Faso can produce more of that food domestically, the objective is no longer simply agricultural experimentation. It becomes import substitution. Think about what happens every time a truck carrying bananas crosses into Burkina Faso. Someone outside the country produced the planting material. Someone outside the country grew the crop. Workers outside the country received part of the income. Transporters moved it across the border. And Burkina Faso paid for the final product. There is nothing inherently wrong with trade. No country produces everything it consumes. But a government pursuing greater food self-sufficiency asks a different question. Which imported products could reasonably be produced at home? Plantain may be one attempt to answer that question. And this is where the multiplication strategy becomes more important than the first harvest. The early planting material reportedly included suckers originating from Ghana. But a plantain plant does not have to be imported again every time another field is created. Healthy plants generate suckers that can be separated, raised, and replanted. That means the first generation can become the source of the next. 81,000 planting units can potentially produce far more planting material. Local nurseries can multiply that stock again. Farmers can then receive locally reproduced plants instead of relying entirely on imported ones. So the real sequence is not simply import a plant, grow a banana, eat the banana. It is import knowledge and initial planting material, learn how to grow the crop, reproduce the planting material domestically, train more farmers, expand production, and eventually reduce the need to import part of the final product. That is a completely different economic model. And it explains why the figure of 400,000 matters. Not because 400,000 is automatically enough to transform Burkina Faso's food system. It is not. The number matters because it represents an attempt to move from a small demonstration to a reproducible domestic capability. The strategic asset may not be the fruit. It may be the ability to reproduce the crop without repeatedly buying the starting material from abroad. That distinction appears small, but it sits at the center of economic self-reliance. A country can import tractors, but can it repair them? It can import solar panels. But can local technicians maintain the system? It can import seed. But can farmers reproduce or access reliable planting material for the next season? The same logic applies here. True agricultural capability begins when production can continue after the initial outside input disappears. And plantain may offer another layer. Officials involved in the program have suggested that sufficiently developed plantain plots could create a favorable microclimate for experimenting with crops such as cocoa and coffee. That does not mean Burkina Faso is about to become Côte d'Ivoire or Ghana. Climate, rainfall, soil, and water availability still impose hard limits. But strategically, the idea is interesting. Plantain may not be treated only as a food crop. It could also become part of a more diversified horticultural system in carefully selected areas of the country. So the hidden ambition begins to look larger. Plantain production, local nurseries, farmer training, irrigation, potential import substitution, and possibly new higher-value crops around the same agricultural infrastructure. But agricultural systems do not scale simply because planting material multiplies. 400,000 plants also multiply the demand for water, fertilizer, labor, disease control, transport, and buyers. And plantain is especially unforgiving on one of those inputs, water. Before we get there, however, look at the same crop from three different perspectives. For the government, plantain is part of a larger political and economic objective. Burkina Faso's presidency has described the program as an effort to diversify agricultural production and move toward greater food self-sufficiency. Under that logic, plantain is not meant to replace millet, sorghum, maize, or rice. It is a test of whether the country can add new commercial crops while keeping more agricultural value inside the domestic economy. But farmers see the question from the ground. At Guiriko, producers involved in the first harvest said they expected plantain to generate higher revenues than the sweet banana they already knew. And in Bacata, producers identified both the opportunity and the risks. They pointed to the crop's relatively long production cycle, heavy water requirement, and difficulty accessing agricultural inputs. That is one of the most important pieces of evidence in this story, because the farmers themselves are telling us that the challenge is not whether a plantain tree can produce fruit. The challenge is whether the economics still work after water, fertilizer, labor, and time are counted. One producer in Bacata said he preferred plantain because of its multiple uses and processing possibilities. That opens another layer. A banana sold fresh creates one kind of value. But plantain can also be fried, milled into flour, processed into chips, or supplied to restaurants and food processors. If production grows enough, the crop could support nurseries, transporters, processors, traders, packaging businesses, and local food companies. But that is still a possibility. It is not yet a proven national outcome. There is not yet enough evidence to say Burkina Faso's plantain program has materially reduced national banana and plantain imports. The plantations remain small compared with national consumption. The 400,000 figure is a multiplication target, not a verified harvest. And a crop can expand rapidly on paper while still failing to create a profitable value chain. So the market is the third perspective. Burkina Faso already buys most of its imported bananas and plantains from nearby Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. Those countries have established producers' transport networks and supply chains. Local farmers do not only have to grow plantain. Eventually, they have to grow it at a cost and quality that buyers will accept. And this gives us a useful way to understand the scale. Using the Kenedougou trial as a rough illustration, 7,500 plants were placed on about 3.5 hectares, a little over 2,000 plants per hectare. At a similar density, 400,000 plants would require roughly 187 hectares. If, and this is a very big if, yields near the reported 30 to 35 tons per hectare could be maintained at that scale, production could reach roughly 5,600 to 6,500 tons. For comparison, Burkina Faso imported about 11,600 tons of bananas and plantains combined in 2024. That does not mean the plan will replace half of imports. The figures are not directly comparable. Yields can fall when projects scale. Post-harvest losses matter, and the trade category includes both bananas and plantains. But the calculation shows why the project deserves attention. 400,000 plants are large enough to become economically meaningful. They are also large enough for every weakness in the system to become economically meaningful. And one weakness dominates all the others: water. According to FAO guidance, bananas can require roughly 1,200 to 2,200 millimeters of water over their growing period, depending on climate and growing conditions. FAO also classifies the crop as highly sensitive to drought. For comparison, sorghum and millet crops, deeply associated with dryland farming across the Sahel, typically require far less water. That contrast makes the plantain experiment look almost contradictory. But there is an important detail we cannot ignore. Burkina Faso is not one uniform desert. The plantain trials we have been discussing are concentrated around the wetter southwest, particularly near Bobo Dioulasso and Guiriko. The Bobo Dioulasso area lies in Burkina Faso's southern Sudanian climatic zone, where annual rainfall can be far higher than in the country's arid north. So this is not a government planting bananas in the middle of the Sahara. The geography was chosen for a reason. But that does not remove the water problem. Because most rainfall is concentrated in a limited rainy season, the dry season can stretch for months. And plantain does not only need a large total amount of water, it needs water consistently. FAO identifies banana as sensitive to water shortage throughout its development. That changes the equation. A field may receive a respectable amount of rainfall over an entire year and still suffer if the water arrives at the wrong time. So when the rainy season ends, where does the next month of water come from? And the month after that? A borehole, a reservoir, a river, a pump, solar-powered irrigations, groundwater. Now multiply that question by tens of thousands of plants, then by hundreds of thousands. This is the hidden cost of scale. The planting material may reproduce locally, but water cannot simply be multiplied. It has to be captured, stored, pumped, distributed, maintained, and paid for. And this creates a much more uncomfortable possibility. Burkina Faso may be trying to reduce one dependency imported food while risking the creation of another dependency, dependence on irrigation infrastructure. If pumps fail, who repairs them? If fuel powers the pumps, what happens when fuel prices rise? If solar pumping is used, who maintains the panels, controllers, and motors? If groundwater becomes the solution, how quickly can it be extracted before recharge becomes a concern? And if hundreds of farmers compete for the same water during the dry season, who gets priority? These questions are not arguments against the project. They are the test that determines whether the project is actually scalable. Because 400,000 healthy plants would represent much more than an agricultural achievement. They would imply that Burkina Faso had also built enough water management capacity to support them. And that may be the most important part of this entire story. The visible project is Plantain. The invisible project is water infrastructure, reservoirs, irrigation, pumping, maintenance, farmer organization, and rules for who gets access when water becomes scarce. So perhaps we have been asking the wrong question. The question is not, can Burkina Faso grow 400,000 plantain trees? The real question is, can Burkina Faso build the water system that 400,000 plantain trees would require without making the crop too expensive, exhausting local water sources, or creating a system farmers cannot maintain? Because if the answer is no, 400,000 plants remain a headline. But if the answer is yes, then Burkina Faso may be building something much more important than a banana industry. So what would it actually take to make this work? Not 400,000 plants, a system. And the first part of that system is water. Burkina Faso has already begun investing heavily in the infrastructure needed to expand irrigated agriculture more broadly. In March 2025, the government transferred roughly 13 billion CFA francs worth of heavy equipment to agencies responsible for dams and hydro-agricultural development. The stated purpose was explicit: mobilize water, develop agricultural land, and reduce the dependence of farming on a single rainy season. 2 months later, the government said more than 2,000 hectares of irrigated perimeters had been developed. Producers also received hundreds of motor pumps. And during the 2024 to 2025 dry season campaign, authorities reported distributing more than 745 solar-powered pumps. This does not mean those pumps or irrigated hectares were all built for plantain. They were not. They belong to a much wider agricultural strategy. But that distinction actually makes the banana story more interesting. Because plantain may be one crop, testing whether this broader water infrastructure can support more intensive agriculture beyond traditional rain-fed production. That is the first mechanism: water capture and irrigation. The second is planting material. The early plantain program relied partly on material originating outside Burkina Faso, but the strategy now appears to be moving toward local multiplication. That matters because agricultural self-reliance is weak if every expansion requires another shipment of planting material from abroad. A stronger system looks different. A small imported stock enters the country. Farmers learn how to manage it. Local nurseries reproduce it. New growers receive material produced domestically. And the next expansion begins without returning to the original supplier. That is how an imported input can gradually become domestic capability. Then comes technical knowledge. Plantain cannot simply be distributed and forgotten. Farmers need to know spacing, nutrient management, sucker selection, disease control, irrigation schedules, pruning, harvesting, and post-harvest handling. The presidency says producers participating in the initiative received capacity-building inputs and hydro-agricultural support. That matters because 400,000 poorly managed plants could produce less economic value than a much smaller number managed well. Then comes the part agricultural announcements often ignore. What happens after the harvest? Fruit has to move. It has to be graded, transported without excessive losses, sold before deterioration destroys the margin. And if production becomes large enough, processing becomes increasingly important. Plantain chips, flour, prepared foods, restaurant supply, possibly other processed products. Burkina Faso has begun adding processing equipment to its broader agricultural program, including transformation units distributed as part of agricultural support packages. But here again, the evidence has to be separated carefully. We can verify that the government is investing in agricultural processing capacity. We cannot yet say that a national plantain processing industry has been established. That remains one of the gaps, and this may be the most important reveal in the entire story. The most important asset in this plan may not be 400,000 plants. It may be the infrastructure and capability required to make the next 400,000 easier to produce than the first. Water systems, local nurseries, trained farmers, input supply, transport, processing, markets. When those pieces reinforce each other, agriculture begins to behave like an industry instead of a collection of isolated fields. But there is also a serious counterargument. Why devote scarce water and public resources to plantain at all? Why not put every additional pump reservoir and hectare into millet, sorghum, maize, or rice? That criticism cannot simply be dismissed. Staple crops remain far more important to national food security. Plantains should not be treated as a replacement for them. The stronger argument is diversification. If carefully selected regions can support higher value crops without undermining staple production or exhausting water resources, then plantain could add farmer income, replace part of an imported market, and develop capabilities that can be used for other irrigated crops. But that argument only works if the economics work. And that brings us to the reality test. Forget the announcements. Forget the number of seedlings distributed. Forget even the photographs of successful harvests. By July 2026, plantain had moved beyond a one-off experiment. Burkina Faso's 2026 to 2028 agro-pastoral, hydraulic, and fisheries offensive formally listed plantain among 6 emerging value chains the government intends to promote. That is significant. But being promoted by policy is not the same as proving economic success. To know whether this strategy is working, there are 5 numbers worth watching. The first is survival. Burkina Faso has reported tens of thousands of plants distributed, and by February 2026, officials said 150,000 had been distributed free to producers since the previous year. But distribution is an input. The real metric is how many plants survive 12 months, especially through the dry season. If 100,000 plants are distributed, but a large share fails before productive maturity, the headline tells us almost nothing. The second test is water. We need to know how much irrigation each hectare actually consumes, where that water comes from, and what it costs to deliver. A borehole-powered field and a reservoir-fed field can have very different economics. So can diesel pumping and solar pumping. And there is another question. Does expanding irrigation improve production without putting unsustainable pressure on local water sources? Without that data, we can say the crop has been grown successfully at selected sites. We cannot yet say the water model is proven at national scale. The third test is yield. At Guiriko, one producer reported potential yields of 30 to 35 tons per hectare. That is encouraging. But one good site is not a national average. The number that matters next is yield across dozens of farms, different soils, different water systems, and multiple seasons. Because trees planted are not the same thing as food produced. The fourth test is imports. In 2024, Burkina Faso imported roughly 11.6 million kilograms of bananas and plantains, combined mostly from Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. If domestic production expands, one of the clearest economic tests will be whether that import volume begins to fall. Not because imports are automatically bad, but because import substitution is one of the economic arguments behind building this capability at home. If local production rises while imports remain unchanged, we need to ask why. Perhaps demand is growing. Perhaps domestic fruit is serving a different market. Perhaps costs are too high. Or perhaps the program is still too small to matter. The data will tell us. And then comes the fifth test, the most important test for the farmer: profit. A government can count plants. A ministry can count hectares. A television report can count harvests. But a farmer has to count what remains after paying for water, fertilizer, labor, transport, crop losses, and time. That final number determines whether growers expand voluntarily when government support becomes smaller. And right now, the public sources reviewed for this story give us encouraging trial yields, repeated harvests, and evidence of local nursery development. What they do not yet give us is a national plant survival rate, a standardized water cost per hectare, a nationwide average yield, or verified net profit per plantain farmer. That missing data is not a reason to dismiss the project. It is the reason to keep watching it. Because the fifth harvest in Guiriko proves something important. Burkina Faso can grow plantain, but the next stage has to prove something harder. That farmers can grow it repeatedly, profitably, with manageable water use, and at enough scale to change the market. That is the line between an experiment and an industry. And now the number 400,000 means something very different from what it meant at the beginning. For Burkina Faso, the first layer of this story is capability. Can the country take a crop that once relied heavily on imported planting material, reproduce that material locally, train farmers, manage water, and produce enough for its own market? If it can, the achievement is not simply more fruit, it is productive capacity. And that capacity can be measured through survival rates, yield per hectare, water cost, farmer profit, and import volumes. Those numbers will tell us far more than the number of plants distributed. The second layer is the Sahel. The lesson is not that every dry country should start planting bananas. Burkina Faso's most visible trials have been concentrated in more favorable zones around the southwest. The larger lesson is whether Sahelian countries can identify places where water-soil infrastructure and markets make new crops viable, and then build the local systems needed to produce them. That principle could apply far beyond plantain, but every crop will face physical and economic limits. Self-reliance does not mean ignoring climate or trade. It means building enough domestic capability to have more choices. And then there is the third layer, the global development question. Many African economies still export raw materials while importing manufactured goods, processed foods, technology, and agricultural products. Plantain will not reverse that structure by itself. 400,000 plants will not transform the Sahel. But that may be exactly why this experiment is worth watching. It gives us something small enough to measure. Did local nurseries reduce reliance on imported planting material? Did irrigation remain affordable? Did farmers make money? Did domestic production rise? Did imports fall? And did the system keep working after the first political attention moved somewhere else? Those questions separate a national project from a national narrative. Burkina Faso has already shown that plantain can be harvested repeatedly, including a fifth harvest reported in Guiriko in February 2026. The harder question is whether those harvests can become a durable value chain. If the answer is yes, then the real significance of 400,000 plants will not be the bananas. It will be evidence that a capability once imported can be learned, reproduced, and expanded at home. And if Burkina Faso can do that with plantain, the next question becomes unavoidable. What import could be next? Tell me which test matters most to you, water farmer profit or import reduction, and subscribe because those are the numbers we will keep tracking. The real story is not what Burkina Faso announces. It is